I stood at the edge of my own property line, watching a ribbon-cutting ceremony unfold on a freshly poured gravel path that ran directly through the flight zone of 11 active beehives. And I remember thinking, with a strange, calm clarity that surprised even me in the moment, that I had warned them in writing on 3 separate occasions exactly what was going to happen if they proceeded with this plan, and that in about 14 minutes, they were all going to find out I hadn't been exaggerating. I heard it before I saw it, a rising commotion of shouting and general chaos carrying clearly across the still morning air, and by the time I walked to my own property line to actually look, the scene unfolding on that new trail was, I want to be honest, exactly what I had spent 3 separate written warnings trying to prevent. A defensive response had triggered from at least 2 of my colonies, likely provoked by the combination of unfamiliar crowd movement directly through their flight corridor and the strong scent of the fruit and sugary drinks laid out for the ceremony. And dozens of residents were now scattering in every direction, several people swatting frantically at the air, at least a handful having already been stung multiple times before the crowd fully dispersed. I want to walk you through what happened in the immediate aftermath, because it moved quickly. Emergency services were called, and paramedics treated several stung residents on site, with 2 individuals, including, notably, a child who turned out to have an undiagnosed mild sensitivity, transported to the hospital as a precaution. Though I want to tell you, with real relief, that everyone involved ultimately recovered fully with no lasting harm. A genuinely fortunate outcome given how easily a situation involving an unknown allergy could have turned considerably more serious. I want to be direct about the several days that followed, because they were genuinely difficult ones, regardless of how thoroughly I had warned everyone involved beforehand. I felt a real, complicated mixture of vindication and guilt, understanding intellectually that I had done everything reasonably possible to prevent this outcome, while still feeling the weight of watching neighbors, including a child, get hurt in a situation involving my own hives, even when the underlying cause was so clearly traceable to decisions made entirely outside my control. Priscilla's initial public response, delivered through a brief statement to the same local news outlet that had been invited to cover the ceremony's original ribbon cutting, characterized the incident as an unfortunate and unforeseeable accident involving aggressive bee activity from a neighboring property, language that, once I read it, moved me from my initial guilt-tinged vindication into something considerably more focused, because unforeseeable was, quite simply, not an accurate description of what had happened, given the extensive paper trail I had already built over the preceding 8 months. I want to introduce you to the attorney I contacted that same week, a woman named Rosalind Nwasu, who specialized in property and premises liability disputes. I brought her all 3 of my written warnings, the state apiary extension office guidance I'd cited, and the email records showing the board's repeated decisions to proceed despite those specific, documented concerns. Rosalind reviewed everything within our first meeting and told me something that shifted my entire understanding of where the actual legal exposure in this situation lay. "Farrokh," she said, "I want you to understand something important here. Given how specifically and repeatedly you warned the board in writing, with professional guidance cited, about exactly this risk, and given that they proceeded anyway, holding a food-centered gathering directly in the flight path against your explicit written objection, the liability exposure here does not point toward you. It points toward the HOA board, and specifically toward whoever made the final decision to disregard those warnings and proceed with the event as planned. I want to walk you through why this mattered so significantly, because several stung residents, understandably upset in the immediate aftermath, had initially directed some frustration toward me and my apiary, a reaction I understood even as it stung, so to speak, given how carefully I'd tried to prevent exactly this outcome. Rosalind's advice was that rather than simply defending myself reactively against any potential claims, I should proactively make the full documentation trail public, both to protect myself and, frankly, to ensure the actual responsible party faced appropriate accountability, rather than the narrative settling into some vague, blameless, unforeseeable accident that let Priscilla's decision-making entirely off the hook. I want to tell you about the community meeting that followed, held about 2 weeks after the incident, because I brought copies of all 3 written warnings, the extension office guidance, and the email correspondence showing Priscilla's repeated decisions to proceed despite my specific, documented objections. I want to walk you through the room's reaction as I read through that timeline methodically, watching neighbors who had been stung, including the parents of the child who'd been hospitalized, realize in real time that this had not been some random, unforeseeable accident at all, but the direct, foreseeable and repeatedly warned about consequence of a decision Priscilla had made unilaterally, disregarding not just my concerns but the actual professional guidance I'd specifically provided. Priscilla, given the opportunity to respond, attempted initially to argue that relocating the trail or ceremony would have been logistically prohibitive given how much planning had already gone into the event, an explanation that a father in the audience, whose daughter was the child who'd been hospitalized, responded to with a level of controlled fury that I think finally broke through whatever remaining defense Priscilla had left. Logistically difficult, he said, compared to my daughter in an emergency room. Those aren't the same category of problem, and I don't understand how you decided they were. The vote that followed authorized a formal investigation into Priscilla's decision-making regarding the incident, and separately, an immediate rerouting of the walking trail to maintain a proper buffer distance from my apiary, consistent with the exact extension office guidance I had cited in my original warnings, a modification that, notably, required considerably less engineering effort and cost than the original route had, since it simply followed an already cleared alternate path along the community's northern boundary that had been considered and rejected earlier in the planning process for reasons that, in hindsight, several residents felt had prioritized a marginally more scenic route over basic safety considerations. I want to walk you through how the liability question ultimately resolved, because several affected families, working with their own attorneys, pursued claims against the HOA directly, rather than against me or my apiary, given how clearly my documented warnings established that the board had knowingly proceeded despite specific, professional-grade risk information. Those claims settled over the following several months, with the HOA's insurance carrier covering medical costs and additional compensation for the affected families, a resolution that Rosalind told me reflected exactly the outcome she'd expected once the documentation trail made clear where the actual foreseeable negligence lay. Priscilla resigned from the board about 6 weeks after that community meeting, and I want to tell you, unlike some more dramatic resolutions I've heard about from friends dealing with their own overreaching HOA presidents, this one ended relatively quietly, mostly because the documentation had made the underlying facts so clear that there was very little room left for genuine dispute once the community actually saw the full timeline laid out. I want to tell you about my hives now, because I know some of you reading this have been wondering. They're doing well, undisturbed once again by the kind of foot traffic that had briefly threatened to disrupt 9 years of careful, peaceful coexistence with my neighbors. The rerouted trail, once completed along its new northern path, actually turned out to be fairly well received by the broader community, offering, several residents told me afterward, nicer views of the community's wooded area than the original route would have provided anyway. If there's a lesson in this story, I think it's something Rosalind said to me during one of our early meetings, reviewing my 3 written warnings laid out side by side. She said that people who dismiss specific, professional, well-documented risk warnings often do so because the warning arrives wrapped in language that sounds, to someone without direct expertise, like ordinary neighborly caution rather than genuine, actionable risk information, and that the gap between those two things only becomes undeniable once the warned-about outcome actually happens, and the paper trail proving it was foreseeable all along becomes impossible to argue around. We had that paper trail, and it turns out that 3 carefully documented written warnings, 1 extension office's professional guidance on hive buffer distances, and 14 minutes of exactly the outcome I had spent 8 months trying to prevent, were more than enough to make sure the actual responsibility for that ribbon-cutting ceremony's abrupt ending landed exactly where it belonged, on the desk of a woman who had been told, in writing, 3 separate times, precisely what was going to happen. Thumbnail text. I warned them and they didn't listen. My name is Farrak Akonkwo Delacroix. I've operated a small commercial apiary on my property in Hollow Creek Meadows for 9 years. 11 hives producing honey I sell at 2 regional farmers markets and to a handful of local restaurants. A modest but genuinely sustaining small business that requires, as any beekeeper will tell you, a fairly specific kind of spatial awareness from everyone living nearby, since honeybees, while generally docile when left alone, become considerably less so when their flight paths are suddenly disrupted by unexpected foot traffic, passing directly through their primary foraging routes. I want to establish something clearly, because it matters enormously for everything that follows. My property sits at the edge of Hollow Creek Meadows, a community of about 240 homes, and my hives had operated peacefully, without a single documented incident, for the entire 9 years I'd kept them, largely because the land immediately surrounding my apiary had always been left as a quiet, undeveloped buffer, exactly the kind of low-traffic zone that allows bees and neighbors to coexist without any real friction at all. That changed about 8 months before this story starts, when our HOA board, under a president named Priscilla Vandermeer Ashcombe, announced plans for a new community walking trail, a genuinely popular idea in the abstract, connecting several previously disconnected pockets of the development with a paved and gravel path system intended to encourage walking and outdoor activity. I want to tell you that I did not object to the trail concept itself when it was first proposed. I attended that initial community meeting and spoke in support of the general idea, only raising concern once the specific proposed route was shared, revealing that the planned path would run directly along the eastern edge of my property, close enough to pass within about 20 feet of my hive rows, cutting straight through what had, for 9 years, been my bees' primary and largely unobstructed flight corridor toward the wildflower meadow they foraged from most heavily. I want to walk you through the specific warnings I gave, because I documented every single one of them carefully, understanding, even at that early stage, that I might eventually need a clear record of exactly what I'd communicated and when. At that first meeting, I explained in detail that honeybees establish consistent flight paths between their hive and their primary forage sources, and that introducing regular foot traffic directly through that established corridor posed a genuine risk of triggering defensive behavior, not because the bees are inherently aggressive, but because sudden, repeated disruption to their flight path creates exactly the kind of perceived threat that can prompt a defensive response from a colony. Particularly during the specific weeks I explained were coming up, when the colonies would be at their most population dense and, correspondingly, their most protective of the hive entrance. Priscilla's response, delivered with a confidence I found genuinely difficult to understand given the specificity of what I just explained, was that the trail route had already been finalized through the community's landscaping committee, and that relocating it would require restarting an already lengthy approval process, adding that she was sure the bees would adjust once the trail opened and foot traffic became routine. I want to sit with that phrase for a moment because sure the bees would adjust is not, in fact, how honeybee behavior works, a detail I explained again, in writing this time, in a formal letter sent to the full board about 6 weeks before the trail's planned opening, citing specific guidance from our state's apiary extension office regarding recommended buffer distances between active hives and high-traffic pedestrian routes. Guidance that explicitly recommended a minimum buffer considerably larger than the roughly 20 feet the proposed trail would maintain from my hive rows. I received no substantive response to that letter, beyond a brief acknowledgement from the management office confirming receipt. I want to tell you about the third and final warning I sent, about 2 weeks before the planned grand opening ceremony. Once I'd learned, through the community newsletter, that Priscilla intended to hold a formal ribbon-cutting event on the new trail, complete with refreshments, and what the newsletter described as light community festivities, planned for a stretch of the path that ran, unmistakably, along the exact section closest to my hives. That final letter was considerably more direct than my previous correspondence. I explained, in explicit terms, that holding a gathering with food, drinks, and a crowd of people directly adjacent to 11 active hives during what I identified as peak late summer colony activity was, in my professional assessment as someone who had managed this apiary successfully for 9 years, a genuinely dangerous plan, and I formally requested, in writing, that the event either be relocated to a different section of the trail or postponed until I could implement additional protective measures, temporary barriers, adjusted hive orientation, anything that might reduce the risk given the specific circumstances of a gathered crowd with food. I received, in response, a brief email from Priscilla stating that the board appreciated my ongoing concerns, but that the ceremony would proceed as planned, since rescheduling at that point would be logistically difficult given how much coordination had already gone into organizing catering, a local news photographer, and several community sponsors who'd contributed toward the trail's construction costs. I want to tell you about the morning of that grand opening ceremony, because I want to be honest about something that I think matters for understanding everything that happened next. I did not sabotage anything. I did not do a single thing to provoke my own bees or manipulate the situation to ensure disaster. What I did do, having exhausted every reasonable channel of warning available to me, was stay home that morning rather than attend, and simply wait, with a mixture of genuine dread and a kind of resigned, told-you-so certainty, to see exactly what would happen when roughly 60 residents gathered with catering trays of fresh fruit and sugary lemonade, directly in the flight path of 11 increasingly agitated colonies, on what happened to be one of the hottest, stillest mornings of that entire summer. Conditions that any experienced beekeeper could have told you were about as unfavorable as possible for introducing a large, food-laden crowd anywhere near an active apiary. The ceremony began at 10 in the morning. By 10:14, it was over entirely, and not in the way Priscilla or anyone else standing at